I really couldn't think of anything I wanted to do more than to do a stream on the topic of exosomes, because for whatever reason, this topic is now becoming almost like a household name among the sort of those health freaks out there. And one reason is because I believe it's because of the development of these mRNA technologies that we, of course, have all been made aware of due to the fact that there has been a great push to enroll the world's population in these experimental gene therapies, which are based on messenger RNA that are packaged into these synthetic lipid membranes, which act almost like viruses, or what are also known as exosomes, which are produced by all the cells of our body, as well as all the cells of everyone's bodies. Now, just really quick, if someone could confirm that they can see us here, if anyone wants to chat, that would be really helpful, because I want to double check and make sure that you are able to see the live stream. So, as I was just saying, there is this general awareness that under the guise of, what we might describe a vaccine agenda, is really an attempt to alter the genetic makeup of billions of people on the planet with these vaccines. And that's a dark expression of what is possible in the realm of these, genetic altering nanoparticles, because there's actually a really beautiful side to it. And in fact, that was a big part of why I wrote the book Regenerate. As some of you may know, a good portion of the book is dedicated to discussing the role that these so-called nanoparticles have in human health and wellness. So that is something that I am going to go into. And I just want to make sure, again, everyone can connect here. Okay, let's see. Yes, okay, I can see myself. Perfect. All right, so if any of you, again, have any comments, questions, just please let me know. So the beautiful part of exosomes is right there at the end of our fork, okay, or the end of my hand, which is that when we eat fruits like apples, they're literally trillions of these little nanoparticles. When I say nano, that's in billionths, right? A billionth. And so a nanoparticle is so small that, if this was a cell, the exosome would be about 1,000th the size. And so all foods and all cells, basically all living things, contain these little particles, which are within the same size range as a good number of viruses. In fact, retroviruses are within the same range as the exosomes found in food, which are about 50 nanometers to 100 nanometers. So this is infinitesimal. You can't see them, but they are found within all the things we eat, and they contain genetic material that is known to affect the majority of the protein coding genes in the human body. Why is that important? Well, for many years, it was believed that the protein coding genes were like the holy grail of health and wellness and disease. If we could figure out what those gene sequences were, then theoretically we could figure out anything that goes wrong with the body and how to fix it. Well, unfortunately, that promise never came into fruition, because in 2005, when the first draft of the Human Genome Project was completed, they found only about 23,000 genes. And that was not enough to account for the complexity of proteins found in even a single human cell, which is about 100,000. So they were extremely surprised to find that the human proteome, or the number of protein coding genes in the human genome, were about the same as found in earthworms. And clearly we're more complex than earthworms, right? So the shock of it was that 98% of the human genome, which was once referred to as junk DNA, or also presently described as the dark matter of the human genome, transcribes into these RNAs. And RNAs, there's a whole family of them, but the one that's most important in our discussion right now is microRNA. And microRNA is unique because it doesn't turn into a protein like messenger RNA. For example, the Moderna vaccine, they have mRNA, and theoretically, the mRNA goes into cells in our body and then helps to produce a protein like the spike protein. It's very clear, right? Messenger RNA turns to a protein. MicroRNA doesn't do that. It's a single-stranded RNA sequence that blocks the expression of messenger RNA in our body. So what that means is it goes to certain receptors of gene sites on cells, and then it prevents those mRNA from producing proteins. So it basically silences genes, much like methylation of genes does. And so this is important because that's going to provide a lot of complexity to gene expression. If you can shut down certain gene sequences, then certain proteins don't function, and that greatly affects our health. And since the majority of protein coding genes has a receptor for microRNA, that means that theoretically, the little microRNAs and those little viral-like exosomes will affect the majority of our physiology, down to the genetic layer. That's a huge finding. And in fact, one of the things that I'll be discussing is new research that shows, for example, that these microRNAs and exosomes taken from, say, beets, for example, are extremely impactful to human health. In fact, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to do this stream, is I have this update that I get from PubMed of various exosome-related topics, and I'm always interested in the ones related to food as information or food as medicine. And in this one, it was very interesting because they basically extracted beet exosomes. They do this with a centrifuge. They extract out this small portion from beet. And this is, again, the concentration of genetic material, basically. Exosomes contain actually other nucleic acids. So they do contain messenger RNA, and they do contain bioactive lipids and other proteins. But the portion that's most interesting, again, is the microRNA. Now, in this study, they found that the beet exosomes, they were able to have an anti-aging property, anti-scarring capability, and in fact, what was most interesting was it had an angiogenic property. Now, in the case of cancer research, angiogenesis is not considered very beneficial because you don't want these tumor sites to start sprouting out new blood supplies, and they tend to spread that way. But in the case of cardiovascular disease, where there's damage to cardiac tissue, angiogenesis is extremely important because your body is able to get around damaged tissue and get blood and oxygen to where it needs it. And what's interesting, of course, is beets are so poetically bloody, and they have been known to increase the synthesis of nitric oxide, which dilates blood vessels, which addresses the primary precursor to arguably much of heart disease, which is endothelial dysfunction, right? When the one cell thick lining of the blood vessels and arteries don't dilate fully. That's what causes additional stress, additional damage to lining of the blood vessels, which then leads to atheroma formation, which is what ultimately causes the end stage of cardiovascular disease, with the calcification of plaques and pieces break off and cause obstruction and then death. So ultimately, we're going upstream to the original problem, addressing it with things like beet. So in this study, they found that, in fact, the beet juice extract of exosomes had a wide range of health promoting effects, including, again, longevity, anti-inflammatory, and then promoting cardiovascular health. Now, this is not the only study. There are many studies. In fact, let me share my screen just to get you kind of excited about what food can do. And of course, keep in mind that the really exciting thing here, I'll start with just a quick overview here, is food is information. Because, for many years, people were thinking, oh, well, food, of course, is important. It provides energy. It's got calories. And calories are a very abstract measurement based on destroying the food by incinerating it, and then measuring the heat by if it can, increase the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 centigrade. That's a calorie, right? So it's a very I would call it Kali Yuga metric for understanding the value of something. And then, of course, you have the concept that food is a building block, right? It has proteins, has lipids, carbohydrates, minerals, and that's what our body's made from, right? So it's like the building block. But that's very limited because it's actually information as well. Not just in the sense of these little genetic sequences found in exosomes, but there are sequences of what they're known as is conformational patterns of proteins that actually carry information as well. So the way the food is structured actually contains information as well. And we know that for water, for example, water has a lot of structure in the form of H3O or EZ water. It contains an immense amount of information and actually energy. So we're starting to reconceive what food is and what biological water is. And a lot of it is information. Now, keep in mind, the word information means put form into. So that's another good hint as to what food is actually doing. Again, not just a fuel that you throw in the hopper and it burns into energy, and not just building blocks, but it has information. And that's really exciting. So going back to some of the research on exosomes, and by the way, there's a link in the description there of this video, our exosome research panel. And of course, on the right is some pretty amazing translational reporting on some of these studies, which we're going to go over here real quick. One of the most profound discoveries was actually in 2012. There was a Chinese research group, Zhang et al., that discovered that by feeding humans rice, there was a particular microRNA sequence that they found went into the blood serum or sera of the patients, as well as the tissues, and altered the expression of, in this case, LDL receptors in the liver, which then positively altered the lipid profile of the patients that consumed the rice. So this was one of the first studies that actually found that these microRNAs in food go into our digestive tract. They survive digestion, stomach acid, and all the other things that go on down there, the intestinal barrier, go into the blood and the tissue and alter profoundly the expression of certain proteins that, again, contribute theoretically to things like cardiovascular disease risk. So that study really blew open this field. And I want to show you, keep in mind that the amazing thing about exosome research here is if you look at the number of studies published on the topic of exosomes going back 20 years, okay? So back in 2007, oh no, that was actually, clicked the wrong thing. There's practically no research available on, let's see. Okay, so let's go back to 2001, 29 papers published on Medline. Now that's nothing relative to other topics like turmeric, where you have, several thousand studies every year. And so you see that it wasn't really until around 2013 here of 600 studies, and then finally going up to 2021, 5,000 studies in a year. I mean, we're talking about exosome research as an industry now reaching, I think it's supposed to be $600 billion in 2025. So we're seeing so much interest, and this came out of nowhere. I mean, back again in 2000, there was practically no research on exosomes, that we didn't even know they really existed or they had any relevance in human nutrition or medicine. And that's one of the points I like to make, because if you go look at the microbiome research, same thing. I mean, back in 2000, it's 74 studies. And now here in 2021, we have 25,000 studies published just in 2021. So you're dealing with kind of like a supernova effect around that critical millennial shift here. And then you go back and look at microRNAs. Yeah, 2000, there's 2 studies published on the topic. Why am I talking about this? Because I'm trying to point out that we've gone through something of an event horizon, scientifically speaking, when it comes to understanding the role that these extremely important aspects of our being play. With the microbiome, this is so important because if you consider that there are more microbes that constitute the total being that we are, also known as the holobiont, right? The human cells, the viral component. The microbiome includes also fungi, bacteria, and then you're thinking about all the other aspects that contribute to making us human. Genetically speaking, we're 99.9% other, meaning like we are more bacteria, more viral than we are actual eukaryotic cells in terms of total genetic contribution to the holobiont, the total human. And now when we extend this out to understand the role of genetic material in food, upon which our bodies depend on their health and wellness, then it becomes even more extreme. And here's a quick example. I wrote a little philosophical piece a while back on Leonardo da Vinci and the new biology. And this was back in 2018. And I'm pointing out, this discovery of, what are essentially genetic elements that are essential for our health and wellness, which come from food. And in a particular paper I'm reporting on, which mentions, again, the holobiont, right? What are humans fundamentally comprised of? Well, we have human cells, of course. Again, there's, 20,000 plus protein coding genes. Not that much, actually, when you start looking at the contribution of the bacteria in our gut. We're talking about trillions of bacteria and thousands of different strains. And then you have fungi and viruses, including bacteriophages. I mean, there's a massive amount of contribution to these things that, of course, in the political theater that we're in, we're supposed to believe that these invisible particles are so deadly that just the thought of them could practically, require us to lock ourselves down for years in our own homes, right? This is where it's gone. It's really it's a theater of the absurd when we are comprised primarily of these, extracellular components, right? Then you have finally the fourth part, and this is my point here, is that food, and we're talking about millions of plants, and there are many animals as well in that equation that contribute to modulating our gene expression. Again, if 60% of our protein coding genes have an element that is responsive to microRNAs in foods, as well as, of course, bacteria. I want to point out bacteria secrete exosomes 24/7 as well, which contain microRNAs. So what we're dealing with here is a new definition. It's more like an open source definition of what it means to be human. Consider, for over 50 years, the central dogma of molecular biology was that there was only one direction that gene expression took, which is the DNA in the nucleus of the cell is transcribed into RNA, which is then transcribed into protein. And you couldn't go back the other way. But of course, then there was discovery of things like retroviruses and reverse transcriptase that do, in fact, take RNA and put information back in our DNA. And then all kinds of other discoveries were made, jumping genes. And then we have prions, which are proteins that laterally transfer their genetic information just by touching other proteins. So that was a radical discovery. There were no nucleic acids even involved in the reversal of the information flow. So now we know that humans are genetically, if you will, open-ended, and there's a constant, if you will, promiscuity between the environment and even the things we eat and our own genetic makeup. So that sort of like hermetic seal was cracked wide open. And a lot of that, again, just happened around year 2000 with the discovery of microbiome, discovery of exosomes, and microRNA. So this is a really important point, again, is that if your gene expression, right, upon which theoretically our health is built, right, that's a big dominant narrative still, is dependent on the foods you eat or don't eat, that means that if you deviate from an ancestral diet, right, that's a big part actually of what I write about in Regenerate. The fourth section is all about the ancestral diet, which means it excludes a lot of things that the modern diet has fixated on, which includes a lot of cereal grass seeds, so grains. Not to say that they're bad, okay? I do believe that we could metabolize practically a nail if we had to, if we had the spiritual and mental fortitude to do so, or we could live off of ether for significant amounts of time. Like, so we can fast, There's a lot of evidence indicating that people have done this and can do this. I've done water fasts. I've felt the ether myself. I'm not advising you do that at home, but I want you to know that a lot of what we have been taught about our dependency upon extrinsic material to stay alive is absolutely myth, and that our body does have a mechanism to capture or transduce what you might call 0-point energy, or energy and information from the quantum vacuum, and express it in the form of our biomass. In fact, I chose the Romanesco cauliflower because it is a fractal, and this meristematic cell at the top of the so-called curd, okay, this beautiful fractal tip, is literally an immortal cell line, and it is sitting there transducing from the quantum vacuum the biomass that you see around it. I mean, this is a miracle, but this is absolutely part of the new biology that I would love people to get more familiar with, because as we understand that we can transduce, photonic energy directly into our bodies through structured water, and that's true for infrared energy in our environment, so it doesn't have to be just sunlight, is that we can eat the environmental radiant energy through the structuring process in the water in our cells, and those cells are basically being driven by that 24/7, as well as chlorophyll mediated capture of photonic energy. So the mitochondria take in the little bits of chlorophyll that are broken down into this little molecule called PBE, and that is actually used for mammalian photosynthesis. Melanin does the same thing. So melanin can capture photonic energy, and it can also perform something like a mammalian photosynthesis, splitting the water molecule, separating the charge, releasing energy. So we know that we can get energy from the environment, right? So our dependency on food may actually be more related to its genetic content than anything else. So what I'm saying is that, and I've said this many times before, I think it's clever, is that we don't get cancer from a deficiency of chemotherapy and radiation, but we do get it from a deficiency of the biologically indispensable information found in ancestral foods. One example, too, that I want to show you is, okay, if I can put this in here, is that, okay, recipes. The word recipe is a French word, right? And it originally meant prescription. So RX comes from that sort of etymological origin. I'm trying to find this slide if I can find it. So when our grandfather used to make a special recipe for our particular ancestors with just the right amount of turmeric or pepper, cooked in a certain way, there was ancient knowledge embedded in that. And recipes are essentially epigenetic inheritance systems. So they provide a framework, an epigenetic framework for the optimal expression of wellness within our gene set. So food mediates the relationship, right, between what our environmental adversities are and our particular genetic predispositions. And so the recipes of our ancestors are literally medical prescriptions. And it comes down again to the etymology. Couldn't find the particular slide I was looking for there, sorry. But, oh yeah, there it is. It was beginning. But so the point is that when we eat certain foods, and again, when you look at cancer, for example, so many people are so afraid of all these chronic diseases that seem inevitable, that we're told are idiopathic. We don't know what causes them. Well, I'm telling you that we do. In the case of cancer, in most cases, it's primarily a byproduct of the interaction between excessive, unnatural, meaning toxicant-based exposures, and you can add in there non-native EMF, which of course is scaling up all around the planet. So those adverse exposures are a primary adversity, which causes the cells of our body to activate resilience pathways that include recruiting stem cells, which ultimately are there to redifferentiate into healthy cells when, the damaged cells need replacement. But the problem is that when overstimulated and or there's an exhaustion process that occurs in certain stem cell lines, they actually turn into cancer stem cells. So cancer stem cells are at the root of the tumor cell hierarchy, because tumors have cells that are benign. A good majority of them are. Only a small subpopulation, about 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 1,000, are cancer stem cells. And those are the cells that are technically immortal. And they are the ones that can repopulate and go elsewhere and create new tumors. So those are the ones that need to be targeted. Those cells are recruited when, for example, there are repeated, incessant challenges to healthy tissue. If you're a chronic smoker, for example, I think we're all clear that chronic smoking will greatly increase your probability of developing lung cancer, for example. It's because you're constantly injuring, and also cardiovascular disease, but you're constantly injuring tissue. So let's say it's the lining of the blood vessels over and over, all day, every day. It's constant recruitment, though, of the healing mechanism, which is, related again to the overlap between regenerative processes and cancer. Because regeneration is recruiting the cell lines that are associated with a quasi-immortality in our body. Cancer, the greatest threat that it poses is that it is an immortalized cell line. So it's ironic, isn't it, that the cancer cell kills the host because it's immortal. And so that's one of the ironies, if you will. So to get back to my original point, it's a lack of eating certain foods that I believe contribute most to the development of chronic diseases such as cancer. And when we add those foods back in, we end up having genoregulatory processes that recruited. We start to see longevity pathways activated and a number of other really profound things. Again, it does relate to the presence of these genetic materials. So it's a lot of science, if you will, but I guess it boils down to trying to make this point, which is when you are making your food choices, you are also really determining, your health destiny in every way possible. And if you start looking at your own lineage, you'll start to understand, like, say you're Hungarian or you're Korean or you're Scottish, is that there are going to be certain foods your ancestors ate that if you can start doing that genealogy and exploring what it was perhaps that they ate and how they ate it, right? That's the pre-industrial revolution manner of consuming food, which was all organic, right? And mostly local and seasonal. This is the way our bodies were meant to regulate themselves. And that's why the new science on exosomes, I think, is really helpful to validate the ancient ways, to help us return to perfect health. It's all possible. Okay, so another thing that I really want people to understand is understanding this profound discovery about viruses. So back in 2014, there was a really profound study that was done, which was the first ever analysis of the architecture molecularly of the virion particle of influenza. So, the thing about influenza is that we're told that it's just this evil virus that's circulating out there, that's hopping from one person to another, and that every year we better be careful or get ourselves vaccinated because we're going to be in deep trouble if we catch it, as if it's just really hopping around with agency and has its own, ability to do this, even though it's defined as an obligate parasite, right? It has no means, right? Ostensibly, other than perhaps someone coughing on you, right? This whole concept. The idea, though, is that when they actually went down and looked at what the influenza is made of, they discovered that a good portion of the lipids and proteins within influenza, okay, here's the study, actually come from the host. So that means if it's a chicken form of influenza, or if it's an egg-derived form, or insect or human, it's completely different, meaning there's host-specific features because the so-called virus is pulling from the host lipids and proteins in order to be what it is, which means that fundamentally the virus isn't other. It's not other than the host. They're inseparable. And that undermines the concept that has become, if you will, profoundly misunderstood and or weaponized, which is the idea that viruses are out there to kill us and they have nothing really to do with us. They're other. Well, this undermines that profoundly. That's why the discovery of exosomes is so important, because fundamentally, they're almost indistinguishable. In fact, in the extraction process, if they're trying to differentiate between viruses and exosomes, it's extremely difficult to do so. So the theory is of course, the differentiating feature of viruses is that they replicate within the host, right? They take over the machinery and they spit out copies of itself and eventually kill the cell. Now, they can't do that to all cells because viruses would be dead with the host, right? So they're not that fatal, right? In that theory. But the thing about exosomes is theoretically they can't replicate that way, right? They just take over. They're part of the endogenous machinery of the cell. Okay, so the idea though is that when you look at certain viruses like HIV, for example, there's a particular medical hypothesis that's out there, which is that HIV is really misunderstood. It's sort of like a Trojan horse. It's an exosome actually, and so that's another sort of rabbit hole to go down. But ultimately, there are differences. Like, I don't believe that the discussion around exosomes should be completely reduced to they're the same thing. But it's important to understand that viral theory, germ theory, with the advent of understanding about microbiome and exosome, it's lost its power, okay? It's become politically more powerful than ever, because how else are you to control billions of people than to scare them to death into thinking that you happen to be able to understand and see and hedge against these invisible particles. But when it comes down to it, the investigation into exosomes and this new research on what these viruses are actually comprised of, it really kind of pulls the energy out of that agenda. So that's an important consideration. I'm just going to see. Okay, looks fine. No questions yet. So that's, I guess, good. But if you do have any, please let me know. Okay, so let's go back to some of the research here. Now, what I found most compelling about the discovery of exosomes is that there is this indication that over time, plants, specifically the plants that feed us humans, which are known as angiosperms, okay? About 200 million years ago, they started to just explode, okay? Actually, I'm sorry, that's a misquote. It's around, I think, 150 million years ago. It was around 200 million years ago that our ancestors, right, complex animal life started to explode in tandem. And so there was a co-evolutionary process. And so some of the microRNAs that are found in exosomes in plants and animals are actually identical, and they fit like lock and key within one another. So there's been this sort of like co-evolutionary process where they've developed together. And what's so compelling about this is that you see certain foods. Okay, let me go back to this particular slide. You see certain foods that they look a lot like the organs that they feed and support. You just can't not go back to the, okay, here's an example. Look at this. Look at the walnut and look at the brain. I mean, you have a bihemispheric nut in there, and you have a meninges-like covering that you'll find in there. You have omega-3 fatty acid-rich fats, very specific to brain health. There are neuroprotective properties and antioxidants in walnuts that have been discovered. You have a skull-like covering. Why is this? Is it just that, like, God winking at us? Like, hey guys, like, you know, I've done this on purpose. It's not just some chaotic accidental process that made this happen. This is explained in part through the relationship between animals that need to eat these seeds so that they can be healthy, and the seed-bearing plants want animals to eat them so that they can distribute the seed. And that's true for fruits, right? Because look, this apple has seeds in it. So if I'm eating the delicious apple and it's full of healthy ingredients that are going to make me live longer, if I consume the seed, I'm distributing that for that plant. I become part of its reproductive system. So I'm actually acting almost like a bee would, right? And in turn, that apple is feeding me and making me healthy and supporting my endocrine system and my reproductive glands. And ultimately, I'm going to live longer and I'm going to reproduce. And this is how it has happened for millions of years. So there's a sharing of genetic information, which comes up literally when you look at the homology. So below that, you see fallopian tubes, right? And then you also see the ovaries. Then to the right, you see pomegranate. And this is one of the more profound discoveries of our time, actually, if I can find it, is that the pomegranate, has long been associated with fertility, as a fertility enhancer, and even an ovarian tonic. And when you look at it from the side, you cut it open, it looks like a mammalian ovary. Well, this was a study I stumbled upon in 2004, and I was really blown away because in that study, they discovered pomegranate contains bioidentical estrogens that are normally only found in mammals, like estradiol, estrogen, and estriol. Those are the three dominant mammalian estrogens. There's also testosterone, and it's shown to have estrogenic activity, so that if you take female rats, which is unfortunately a cruel but very revealing methodology, this is vivisection-based scientific research, and you give a group of these female rodents that have had their ovaries taken out pomegranate, and the other group doesn't get pomegranate, the group that doesn't get pomegranate starts to develop all the symptoms of menopause, which include things like bone loss, depressive states, midsection fat accumulation. In the group that gets the pomegranate, it's as if their ovaries were not taken out. Now, I love this. In fact, this was going to be the cover of my book because this was one of those insights when I read this years ago that I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. Because it wasn't just the ovary of the pomegranate bush, because that's what that is, by the way. That's the fruiting berry or ovary of the pomegranate bush. But it was also soy, okay, which is another example. And then it was oranges. There were a number of fruits or berries that did the exact same thing. So doesn't that speak to why women, especially perimenopausal, menopausal, should be consuming these foods? Now, keep in mind, nature is just, it's a miracle, because not only is it like an ovary, but it's like a human heart. I mean, it bleeds like the human heart. And of all tonics on the planet for cardiovascular disease, this is the one substance that can reverse plaque buildup in the artery. In carotid artery stenosis, an Israeli study showed profound reversal of blockage within a matter of a few months of just drinking pomegranate juice concentrate. And on top of the fact that even when it doesn't reduce the size of the atheroma or plaque, it reduces the atherogenicity or the instability of that plaque. It makes it more stable, less likely to break off, not to mention has all these other benefits. So going back to the idea here is that the pomegranate, just like the walnut, it's like a food. It's like it's poetry. It's poetry. It basically shows you that the thing it looks like it actually can feed. Like look at flax seeds. There are these little endothelial-like cells that produce a mucilaginous gel, just like the lining of the mucosa throughout your body. It could be your sinuses or your intestinal tract. And when you consume flaxseed, it has a soothing effect. It can help to stimulate regeneration. So this is the beauty of the discovery of exosomes, is that there is a cross-kingdom transfer of information. Did I just stop sharing that? Yeah, okay. No, actually, let me see. Let me share again. Share screen. There's a cross-kingdom transfer of information between species. And so that means fundamentally that the biosphere is one. It's an interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh called it. There's a spiral of life. It's open source. There's permeability. Things communicate with one another constantly. there's a galaxy of, I'm trying to find this study, sorry. There's a galaxy of particles being emitted by your cells and all cells in your environment. Okay, where is that? Okay, I think it was here. Yeah, this is a deeper dive into this. Wait. Okay. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I don't want to make you dizzy. But yeah. So ultimately, what we're talking about here is a new model of health, nutrition, and our inseparability with nature. Is that ultimately one paper that is profound on the cross-kingdom transfer of epigenetic information through exosomes, meaning plants and animals and bacteria all communicating with these particles, this galaxy of particles which contain exosomes, is that it's as if it re-invokes Lovelock and Margolis's concept of the Gaia hypothesis, is that ultimately there is a permeability and a communication happening horizontally 24/7. So we're all part of the same system. And this is important, of course, because this is one of the things I do need to show you here. For those who are still really interested, this is another really profound discovery that very little reporting was done on. But this was back in 2014. This study, soma to germline transmission of RNA in mice with tumor cells, possible transport by exosomes. What they did is they basically found a way to tag certain cells with a fluorescent marker. And then they were able to track the secretion of exosomes from the body cells, right? Not germline cells. Germline cells are like sperm and egg, right? They contain these immortal cell lines that come back from all our previous ancestors going back 3.4 billion years or further. So that immortal cell line's been replicating for inconceivable number of replications, so that all the things on the planet contain the same ancestor, Luca, last universal common ancestor. So it's immortal. So we have an immortal thread within our body. So the soma cells are not immortal. They die. And of course, the only cell lines in our body that don't die are the ovary cell as well as the sperm cell. And so what happens is that the soma cells, though, produce exosomes, which contain genetic information, which in this study they tagged with a fluorescent marker and found that it went right into the sperm. So that means that the information from my body cells can be transferred to the germline and then affect my future progeny down through that vertical line into forever. So that was the first time that a mechanism was identified that proves Lamarckism, which, by the way, Darwin himself was Lamarckian. He made great indication that he believed that, say, if you were, a blacksmith, that your offspring would be more likely to have those skills. This is well known, and we all see it around us. Like we have qualities and characteristics, not just physically, but other talents and skills and spiritual qualities from our parents. So this study showed that basically we can't just think of genetic changes as happening at a glacial pace, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years before some protein coding sequence in the cell changes and then transfers down the line. It's that everything we do, everything we eat, every chemical we're exposed to, every electromagnetic impulse could affect the coming generations. And that is a profound discovery. So that's how important the discovery of exosomes are, is it really just opens up a whole new worldview of infinitely more responsibility for our health destiny and the destiny of our future on this planet, for our children, our interconnectivity with all things within the biosphere. I've been saying this for many years. You can't just go to Whole Foods and throw into your cart, the best food in the world and think you're protected, because everything in our environment is interconnected. Is that until we heal the biosphere and we turn back the juggernaut meat grinder of a system that we are part of, and start actually contributing to regenerative agricultural structures and other agricultural movements that are giving back, or what they sometimes call net positive, this is what is going to make it possible for us to maintain health on this planet. It's not just going to be some elite that can afford to eat a Whole Foods. It's going to be all of us working together and acknowledging that the impacts we have in our environment come right back at us, in every way possible. But what it also does is it gives us profound power, because if we are not just a byproduct of these arbitrary nucleotide sequences in our protein coding genes inherited from distant ancestors, and that, the gene time bomb just goes off and we end up with a disease, but that it has everything to do with our mindset, chemical exposures, again, non-native EMF, what we eat as food, then that is going to greatly liberate us. I mean, it provides so much power to our ability to really be in control of our health destiny. And that's exciting. Oh, wow. I actually see a question. Okay. So, Sayer, can you get exosomes from beets or green powder instead of the whole raw food? Also, any thoughts about beef liver powder? Yeah, this is a great question. So the thing about food is it all contains exosomes, and your body is likely going to extract from it. Now, there are some protocols that have been introduced that show how we can extract exosomes, and there's going to be more of this. In fact, for years I've been looking to work with individuals on producing supplements that extract exosomes. There's something about it that's very exciting to me because it's so targeted. For example, a lot of the medical research community is starting to move from using stem cells, which are sometimes unethically, obviously, and morally, taken from fetuses, right, to that have been unnaturally terminated, from placental cells, which are at least more ethical if it's voluntary, have now moved from extracting the exosome fractions from those cells and have found as good and even better results than using the whole cells. So a lot of the stem cell therapies you're hearing about, they might extract your own fat tissue and grow the stem cells. The exosome portions are being shown to be safer, more easy to manage in terms of perishability, and just as effective, if not more. But I'm interested in extracting them from foods because I believe that is where, for so many millions of years, we got most of our genetic information. And that's what's going to help to protect us on a number of levels, because, we haven't even talked about polyphenols and the xenohormetic role they play, like curcumin in turmeric and catechin in green tea, resveratrol in grapes. Those things are absolutely essential in helping to maintain these longevity pathways. And actually, a lot of research shows that those polyphenols actually contribute to greatly altering the expression of our own endogenous microRNA sequences. So there's such a fascinating interplay between those components. But let's just go down to the basics. Again, it's about eating the best quality foods, wild harvested, organically grown, biodynamic, permaculture grown. This is what our bodies need more than anything. But the other part of it is about animal products. So I'm really glad you asked that. So isn't it interesting? There was once this yogi that stated to his students that their toes were curled over like chicken's feet because they were eating too many eggs and chicken products. And at the time, this was probably 2 decades ago, I was like, really? Some part of me was like, well, energetically, that kind of makes sense. But now we actually know that animal products, especially milk, contain a whole set of bovine exosomes specific to baby cows, that when humans consume them, it opens up all of these non-human patterns of hormone expression, protein expression, cytokine expression. So now we know why cow's milk can cause some individuals to get really sick. Others who maybe had several hundred or thousands of years of adaptation, let's say Caucasians to milk, they may actually do better, but it might also explain why their body types have changed dramatically. So, there's a big talk out there about transhumanism, and obviously look at the agendas that are being promoted. Look at Elon Musk's Neuralink with the USB port in your head and them uploading and downloading information into us as if we're machines. And look at the mRNA vaccine technology, which is, coerced gene therapy that violates, basic medical ethics. they're trying to turn us into something that is not natural. Well, by the way, we've been doing that to ourselves as well through consuming certain foods that are arguably not suited for our species. I've made that argument with wheat, actually way back with my Dark Side of Wheat essay. It's looking at the 23,000 plus proteins that are just not suited for human metabolism because we don't have the disulfide bonded protein digesting enzymes in the human genome to break down these gluten containing proteins. But so we get into that another time. But my point is that when we eat animal products, it's almost like what the Native Americans used to acknowledge, is that you get a certain spirit from that animal and you actually can become part of it. So like, you are what you eat is the fundamental way of communicating what exosomes mean for human nutrition and medicine. So when you go from meat containing diet to, let's say, completely vegan, there's some people have healed themselves of profound diseases with that transition. Others have gotten sick. So it's not perfect for everybody. But the idea here is that if we really want to be on the front, like the leading edge of medicine, it's really looking again at the role that food plays. It's always been the most important. You look at the work of Nicholas Gonzalez, MD, primarily through nutritional approach, he was healing people of end-stage cancers, went into remission 20, 30 years later. My colleague Nick Paluzzi actually just did a docuseries about cancer where he interviews some of Nick Gonzalez's patients, and you'll find that just nutritional tweaks, and these are people that even went through conventional treatment that probably should have died from just the side effects of the oncological interventions, still alive. So food is the most powerful means of healing, with the one caveat that it's actually more psychospiritual ultimately. Like, there are ways to recruit the healing properties of our spirit that are going to transcend even food. But when it comes to food as nutrition, that is the future of medicine, clearly, in my opinion. So that's a really good question. Let me see. Hopefully I answered it a bit. Let me see. Food. Let's see. Any other questions? Feel free to ask. That's the other thing, is that I just wanted to speak a second about the debate over exosomes and viruses when it comes to, really what we've all been facing here. And which is, again, this notion that this particular particle from Wuhan is now still holding the entire world hostage, and that some future variant is just going to happen to sprout up probably during the next cold and flu season, right? Where they declare another pandemic. We see the World Health Organization presently coming up with their pandemic treaty, which is an attempt to, accrue to itself, the sole power to, basically preempt all sovereign nations' constitutions and all their citizens' rights, because they can just say, sorry, guys, there's another variant that we just thought up here, variant number 500. And by the way, you all have to lock down. You all have to have your masks. And by the way, have you had your 16th booster yet? So this is what they're constructing globally. But when you really start to look at the role that viruses play and the relationship to exosomes, is, what are viruses? They're pieces of genetic information in search of chromosomes, right? They're jumping horizontally, theoretically, and they're performing a profound service, because if you look at how long it takes, again, for the protein coding genes to go through significant change, i.e. mutation, it can take hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. How the heck do humans adapt to environments on the earth that can change in a blink when you're dealing with catastrophism? Look at the 13,000 years ago when we were struck by a meteor and most of the Earth's population was eradicated overnight. I mean, we've had to deal with huge challenges in changes in climate, changes in nutrition, changes in everything. And if we were dependent upon the adaptability of our protein coding genes, we'd all be dead. Okay, so how do our genes change in real time? They change through the virome. The virome is a means by which the body is able to alter its genetic expression to accommodate radical changes in the environment. So it's a mechanism for adaptation, for resilience, and that's its primary function. One could argue that, of course, secondary function is like the forest floor, and you find viral expression at the very moment that the cells are degrading, normally through, if it's a natural process, apoptosis. And it just turns out that that is one of the sets of nanoparticles that are indistinguishable at times from viruses and exosomes, which are apoptotic bodies which are produced when cells break down. So what I'm saying is that a lot of what we think viruses are is, okay, we see cells that are dying and we say, oh my God, look at these little particles coming off of those cells. They must be killing the cell. No, actually that cell has lived a long life of exposure to inappropriate foods, chemicals, radiation, and guess what? It's dying, because if it doesn't, it's just not sick, it's not performing its function, then your whole body will die. So it's good that it's going through programmed cell death. And in that process, it's undergoing a degradation that emits certain particles and even recruits certain bacteria and viruses in order to break it down. That's a destructive cycle so the creative cycle can begin. That's what regeneration is. It's like a flame. It's a constant breaking down and then reforming. So to attribute illness that is caused by well-known adverse environmental exposures to the cells of our body, to invisible particles that happen through an electron microscope to be visible when you look at it through that lens, and then say that the particle being emitted caused the cell to die, that is the greatest, if you will, biomedical false flag that you could ever invent, right? It's all backwards. So does it mean that viruses don't exist? No, it doesn't mean that at all, because technically they're part of what I have coined the term a xenogen. A xenogen takes the term xenohermetic and the term pathogen and puts it together. So xenohermetic exposures can include toxic chemicals in small amounts and even radiation, which cause the body to recruit resilience and longevity pathways and antioxidant response systems. So technically, that's what happens when I go work out intensely and I push my body to the edge where injury is happening on the micro scale. If I go too far, I could really hurt myself. But if I go just enough, I get the most profound regenerative wave of hormones and stem cells, and you just start to regenerate. So that same thing is true when exposed to certain particles emitted by cells of those who are sick, not from a particle like a virus, but sick because their body has a burden of toxicity. So for example, your cells over time accumulate a lot of toxins. And so when you're undergoing influenza-like symptoms, your body, first of all, you're not eating. So that's called sickness syndrome. You don't want to have sex. You don't want to socialize. You're not eating. You're finally resting in bed for the first time, maybe in years. All the crap you've accumulated, not just physically, but even emotionally, it has to basically get processed and eliminated from the body. The fever, and I can thank Dr. Cowan for this, helps to liquefy the easy water. Now, by the way, easy water, which is part of this fourth phase of water, H3O2, it has a component to it which is known as the exclusion zone. And the exclusion zone is what lines the membranes of your body, and it basically pushes out solutes, which include all the toxic gunk that's out there. Okay, it could be inorganic minerals, it could be radionuclides, it could be glyphosate, whatever, pharmaceutical byproducts, and it excludes it. But the thing about the cells of your body is, someone pokes you with a sharp object, you don't just leak out all your water, you're a gel. You're basically a gel. And so when you heat up the gel in a fever situation, you're able to exclude and exude more of the solute that has accumulated. So all that toxic gunk is able to be eliminated. It's dumped, either through sweat glands or into the blood, which then hopefully get eliminated through urine or through the alimentary canal. So all the symptoms that we have misattributed as being deadly are the symptoms required for your body to detoxify and ultimately regenerate. Do people die in that process? Absolutely. Is it as common as we're told? No. So, for example, if you suddenly go off alcohol as alcoholic, okay, or Klonopin, you could die because your body goes through too quick a detox. So if you have not given yourself a chance to rest, if you have suppressed or haven't had the energy to have a full-blown influenza healing crisis, guess what? You might end up with cancer. And that's true, is that people that do not end up clearing themselves of chronic disease often don't have as severe acute bouts of things like influenza. They can't put a blanket on and sweat themselves out because they're so sick. They could end up seizing, or they could end up having some organ damage. So the point is that you have to be healthy enough to even have influenza so that you can have that healing crisis. So what happens when your body is going through a healing crisis in those circumstances? Well, one of the things it's doing is emitting these nanoparticles, which contain signals, some of them nucleic acid based, which in the surrounding area, if someone in your vicinity needs that information, then they will take that particle in and it can activate a number of pathways, again, consistent with influenza-like symptoms or cold symptoms. So in other words, what we perceive to be contagion as some evil thing that's bad is actually used as a interspecies mechanism, okay, inter-individual, I mean, within the species mechanism for herd immunity. How did we get this whole concept of herd immunity that the vaccine industry and medical industry has weaponized in order to promote vaccines? It came from the observation that groups of animals and humans end up getting sick together, but not always. Exposure does not equate infection, just like vaccination does not equate immunization. That word immunization is absolutely a semantic hoax, right? So the same thing is true. You can be exposed, and you probably have, to someone who's terribly sick and not get anything. Why is that? Because your body gets to choose whether it needs that program. So what happens then is that the viral particle and or exosome that is emitted by a sick person actually is performing a xenogen function. It's providing information that's essential for that person to have the opportunity to become more resilient. They have to go through a healing crisis often to do so. They don't freak out and they end up doing things right, resting, getting hydrated, basically helping to support the symptoms and not completely suppress them with chemicals and end up with new disease. Then they will end up benefiting and they will survive. And it's survival of the fittest, but in a way that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's how it works. Okay, so if you are an animal and you're eating a stressed grape, okay, it's stressed because it's gone through climate fluctuations like drought. And so what happens, it produces more resveratrol. The resveratrol is an antioxidant. So as a byproduct of being stressed, it has to almost produce its own immune system, its own defenses, its own antioxidant systems. If an animal consumes it, that's part of the xenohermetic hypothesis. It ends up getting activated, the same pathways that will enable it to survive when an impending climate change or adversity happens to it. And that's because they're both, remember, linked karmically. If the plants do well, we eat their seeds, we do well, we're both well. So we're linked in that xenohermetic relationship. So technically, it's the same thing, is that when one member of a community gets sick and is having this healing crisis, the information being emitted can be beneficial to other individuals. Okay, but what's happened is that the political system, which is many hundreds of years in the making, has taken this natural phenomenon and they've turned it into, Satan incarnate. This is the death card that they play in order to control the world, and it's been very effective. It's preempted all sovereign nations, this pharmaceutical agenda takeover, and it's predicated on a very, if you will, dark ages understanding of how the body functions. So to me, the xenohermetic hypothesis or xenogen hypothesis gives room for there being viral component, gives room for even death in certain cases, and it also helps explain how exosomes will always continue to perform their vital role in helping to preserve the health of not just individuals, but groups of individuals, species, and then, of course, the entire realm of the tree of life or spiral of life. Is that there's a constant communication happening, and it's how Gaia operates. Now, there are other levels to this. This is if you think about it in terms of wave particle duality, we're talking about the particle dimensions of biomedicine and biology. There's a wave dimension too that I have not discussed yet, which to me is even more interesting. Let me just say real quick, if I'm so afraid that I'm going to get ill because I think you have COVID-19 variant number 28, that fear produces a energetic physiological response in me that can literally cause particles to form in the form of exosomes, which transmit information that could cause illness. So in ways, the very thing that they say has happened, like this mind virus or Wetiko media-borne virus of fear, can actually create the literal expression of fear in the body epigenetically through exosomes. Like, so, I mean, this is actually confirmed by Luc Montagnet's DNA teleportation study. I mean, he's a Nobel laureate, so that's why people took it seriously when he published this. There's a lot there that we could discuss in the future, but I'm just trying to leave room for people to understand the way that things that may appear to be conventional germ theory based illness might actually be something completely different and beneficial. I mean, it fundamentally comes down to this. Do we trust our body, or do we trust this medical elite authority out there that is totally governed by pharmaceutical interests and other agendas? I mean, I don't like to be too either or, but I think in this circumstance, we really have to kind of ask that question and start cultivating real trust, real responsibility for our own health. And that's ultimately what I hope some of my work is doing to support you. So let me see. Okay, well, I think, let me just double check. Okay, at least nice thing about heart transplant. Yeah, so Kathy, yeah, that's one reason why they're using exosomes instead of whole cells for regenerative medicine, is because of the rejection challenge. So interestingly, some of the cells that would cause rejection, if you take the exosomes, then it doesn't do that. So there's definitely some benefit to this direction. But again, I'm more interested in supporting our body's ability to produce our own and getting them from foods or plants. So when you eat that apple, this, I mean, I can't tell you, I mean, even Regenerate, this is what I'm advocating, is try a mono diet of apples. This is the most healing thing you could probably do in most circumstances to reset yourself. Take a day, just eat apples. Whenever you're hungry, eat another apple. If you're not really hungry, you won't eat another apple, I'll guarantee it. But by the end of that day, you're going to feel completely different. And if you feel like it'll be beneficial, you might go to 2 days, and then you really start to feel a sort of freedom and a cleansing. It's really a beautiful experience. So, and not to mention all the exosomes that are flooding your body.